In the spirit of reconciliation, Law Squared acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today.
Hello and welcome to Governance, Balancing the Dual Roles of General Counsel and Company Secretary, presented by Law Squared. I'm going to be your host today. I'm Law Squared's Chief Legal Officer and my name is Kate Marshall. For many, tackling that dual role of both being General Counsel and Company Secretary can be either daunting or it's something that you're working towards or really want to have in your skill set and on your CV. I think from my observation, it requires quite different skills. And today we're going to have a number of really experienced people talk to you about what it's like to actually navigate those particular challenges and how it might work in practice. So whether you've landed your first company secretary role or whether it's something that you have an ambition to work towards, the intent of this webcast is that we're going to give you a few tools, a few practical examples and some good knowledge that will help you manage in both of those capacities. And to guide the discussion today, we've got a really wonderful group of talented, energetic, and I think pretty inspiring panelists. So first, I want to introduce you to Ilona Meyer, who's an experienced general counsel and non-executive director. She's got experience spanning health, defence, emerging technology industries. She's made really significant contributions in the promotion of corporate governance. She's managed global teams through digital transformation, and some pretty complex commercial transactions. So Ilona is currently the Global General Counsel and Company Secretary at Nuix Limited, and we're fortunate enough to work with her and her team through our Law Squared as a Service engagement. She's also a non-executive director and chair of the Audit and Risk Committee at MicroX Limited. She holds multiple other chair positions, incredible CV, Ilona, and she has also been recognised as one of the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics in 2024. Wow. So really pleased to have you join us on the panel, Ilona.
Thank you, Kate. It sounds almost too good to be true, but it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great. Look, I'm also delighted to have two of my Law Squared colleagues join us. The first one is our commercial and corporate lawyer, Georgie Gane, very much underselling herself with that title, but she's a recent appointment to Law Squared and is leading our LSAS business, the Law Squared as a Service business I mentioned earlier. But she's had previous experience balancing these two roles, both being GC and company secretary for Pepperstone until she joined us. And before that, she had a role as in the in-house team at MYOB. Georgie continues to advise boards, executive teams, other stakeholders on a range of general commercial law matters across different jurisdictions. So really great to have you here today, Georgie.
Thank you, Kate. It's so good to be here.
And finally, we have Joanna Brand, who's recently joined Law Squared. Joanna brings a range of energy experience, but also different experiences across, again, a range of sectors. She's had both General Counsel and Company Secretary roles with NASDAQ listed entities, ASX listed entities, and it goes on and on. She's worked across a range of sectors from, airlines, being at Qantas and Jetstar, to energy with roles at Cenex Energy and Duke Energy. She's also had a number of director roles. She's currently on the board of Powerlink Queensland and is the Deputy Chair of the Melbourne Writers' Festival. So thanks very much for joining us, Joanna.
Thanks, Kate. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, well, before we actually leap into this discussion, just a couple of housekeeping matters around how we're going to manage questions today. I really hope that all of you will find this an interesting chat and have lots of questions for our panellists as we go through this. If you can just pop those questions into the chat, what we'll do is we'll collate them. We're going to run out of time, I have no doubt. So we'll collate them and then we'll provide some more detailed responses and resources in the coming days. So please, I'd encourage you to continue to put those questions in and we'll get back to them shortly. Well, I think if we can get straight into it with our panellists, and I thought it'd be interesting to get some context around how each of you sees the roles and responsibilities of a GC versus a company secretary. Ilona, perhaps you could provide some context. How do you see the two roles? Is there a bright line between them, that role of being a GC and a company secretary? Or is it a little kind of murkier than I've portrayed?
Look, I think, Kate, there's definitely some overlap. There's skills that we have as lawyers that we bring to the table, and there's skills that you have as a governance professional. So I think the similarity in terms of our knowledge of the law is definitely an overlap. But I do see the two roles really quite differently in terms of the skill set that you bring to the table. As lawyers, we give advice. We see, maybe the grey a little bit more, depending on the advice that we're giving to our client. Whereas I think a company secretary is a lot more black and white in terms of process and governance. So sometimes there's a little bit of an internal conflict. I think you need to understand which hat am I wearing at this particular time. But I think the company secretarial aspect is definitely a lot more process driven. You need to have really good procedures in place to follow because it can get quite complicated and sometimes, particularly in the size of the organisation that you're in, you might be doing it all yourself. You might not have the additional headcount or the bodies to help you manage all of that information. Likewise, when you're at the table as a lawyer, you've also got the luxury sometimes to do two things. Sometimes the board gets the advantage of getting real-time legal advice, but also sometimes you can say, look, let's put a placeholder and we'll come back and provide that advice. So they are two different skill sets, but I think there is some overlap.
Yeah, interesting. Joanna, Georgie, what's been your experience around the two different roles?
So look, I think another really important distinction, just building on what Ilona has said, is about your stakeholders. So when you're general counsel, your stakeholders tend to primarily be perhaps the executive team, internal clients, if you've got a team underneath you that you're helping to lead. When you're in a CoSec role, you are generally dealing a lot with the chair and the other directors and perhaps more different regulators than you might in your GC role. And I think that can sometimes be a much more nuanced stakeholder management process as a CoSec. And then obviously the reporting lines as well. As CoSec, you will generally have that reporting line to the chair and the board. And sometimes perhaps your other manager, which is generally the CEO, but might be the CFO or someone else, doesn't really understand the distinction there. So there's sometimes an education piece to do around that as well.
I completely echo what each of you have said. I think it also depends a little bit on the size of the business and the maturity of the businesses.
Whether those two hats can be properly defined, and it's really on you to do that. If you're in a business where, and in my experience, a slightly smaller business, privately held, you're kind of a jack of all trades as a general counsel anyway, and then you overlay the company secretary piece almost as an add-on. It's incumbent on you to be really clear in your own head. What am I going into this meeting for? What am I talking to the CEO about? Which hat am I wearing? And if you've got managers that are also directors, being clear with them as well. It can be quite fluid and quite grey for both roles when you're in those smaller businesses. So yeah, it can be challenging.
Yeah, interesting. For me as an outsider, look, I've never been either in a GC role or in a CoSec role, so I'm coming from that lack of experience in providing this observation. But it looks to me, when you have the dual role, that there's a lot of scrutiny on you and a lot of responsibility. So many of the audience may be thinking, gosh, why would I want to do that? And I suppose in the back of my mind, I've got the James Hardy case and that question about, can we be clear? Can we be independent about which hat we're wearing at what particular point in time? I also hear from you that there can be advantages and there can be a really interesting role. So perhaps we want to start with, what are those good things that you've all found in having a dual role? Can I start perhaps with you, Georgie? What do you see the positives of having both roles at once?
Oh, there are heaps. I think having that seat at the table, literally, that exposure to the board, to the directors, to that sort of extra layer of strategy and thought that goes into running a business that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were just an executive, not just an executive, if you were part of the executive team only. I think that's a huge advantage. And the other thing I would say, it is an opportunity to, building on that, to showcase your skills that you've developed as a lawyer, because, I think both Ilona and Joanna have pointed out, there are skills that we have as general counsels that really lend themselves to the CoSec role. And certainly if you are performing a role as company secretary, those skills, that stakeholder management, also the ability to just communicate well, all of those things, it gives you an extra limb to your skill set, and it allows you to demonstrate those to people that otherwise wouldn't see them. And I think that's a big advantage as well.
Yeah, interesting perspective. So Joanna, or Ilona, anything you want to add to the advantages of having the dual role?
I mean, I really enjoy the dual role, and a lot of it is, as Georgie said, being privy to those board discussions. I think it gives you such a broader strategic understanding of the business. It will help you, obviously, if down the track you might be interested in becoming a director. You've sort of sat on the other side of the table as the CoSec and can sort of understand what directors want and need. And I do think it can help you better manage the legal team. I remember one particular instance where the role I was in as GC CoSec reported not directly to the CEO through another executive, and so information was hard to come by at times just because they were so busy. And I just remember being in a board meeting and the legal team had received a message about, a potential issue under a contract in a certain jurisdiction. And we went, yep, that's on the list of things to do. And it was pretty far down the list of things to do. And I'm sitting in the board meeting and someone made a comment about, that contract represents 60% of our revenues in this jurisdiction. And all of a sudden I went, oh my God. And I was sort of emailing the team from the meeting going, red alert, like that is not let's worry about that a month from now. That's kind of, we need to, but I had no context. We had no context as a team. No one had given us that information. So being able to be in that discussion at the board level and understanding what the impact was going to be on the business if there was an issue with that contract helped us to appropriately prioritise that work.
Yeah, what a great practical example. Ilona, anything you want to add?
Look, I would 100% agree, particularly with that seat at the table comment, particularly when you're not necessarily an established GC or you're new into an organisation. You become a very good listener because you get to have that seat at the table and you learn so much more about the strategic direction of the company. It absolutely does help you in terms of managing legal issues with the legal team, because that extra oversight, the layer of understanding that you ordinarily wouldn't get from perhaps directly from members of the exec or your internal client. But also when you're thinking about career progression, having that seat at the board table albeit in a company secretarial role, you are exposed to so much more than somebody else that has never ever sat in a boardroom. So from a competitive perspective, I think it's very helpful because you do understand what process looks like and you do understand the issues that directors have, and you already bring that then to the next board that you may then sit on. So I think from a career progression perspective, it's also very helpful.
Yeah, great points. Well, let's dive into the other side of it. So this is the side I always hear about, those challenges of managing both the potential for there to be seen to be a conflict of interest, managing legal professional privilege in terms of your GC role versus the CoSec role, perhaps the regulatory scrutiny that might come with holding dual roles. Can any of you really tell us how you feel about some of those tensions, how you navigate those challenges? Am I painting too gloomy a picture here? What's it like in practice?
I'm happy to jump in only because we seem to be dealing with regulators a little bit. Look, I actually don't see it as a downside. I think if your own practice, as you know, as a GC, when you're sending an email every day, not every email is going to be privileged. The same sort of, and when you go to send an email that's privileged, you mark it privileged and confidential, and you make it your practice that's, you're giving advice and this privilege will attach. The same sort of process happens when you're in the boardroom, where you're there primarily in your capacity as CoSec and you're taking minutes. And then there may be discussion that comes up. Instead of just typing the word confidential and privileged, I then say it. What I'm about to talk to you about is confidential and legally privileged. And I literally put my pen down at the time because no one else is taking minutes at that point in time because it's privileged, it's confidential, and it's almost a sure way that you can ensure I had a confidential privileged discussion and it's not minuted in that fashion. So I think as long as you're disciplined in how you manage that, I think it's actually an advantage. It's not something that the lawyers have to go through the minutes later and go, oh, that's privileged, we need to cut that out. I think in real time, if you've got a good discipline in your own practice, I actually see it as an advantage.
Ilona, do you ever utilise external counsel in those board meetings if it's something perhaps that is particularly high risk to even more clearly delineate that legal advice is being given?
I do. We do have instances when lawyers do come in to give, maybe greater oversight or more in-depth analysis of whatever it is that we're working on. And that's even more clear, but I have been in that instance where I've given the advice and clearly minuted it. I think that was kind of key to that process. Yeah.
It's interesting from a crisis management perspective that often that sort of dual-hatted tension tends to rear its head quite prominently in that moment. And there's a case, you talked about James Hardy, but there's the case, the Optus case associated with their data breach. And the court found that privilege was waived over a forensic report, and one of the reasons why the judge made that decision was because the General Counsel and Company Secretary was found to be wearing both hats, not just the General Counsel hat. And it was really interesting reading a bit about that decision. It wasn't just about what the GC and CoSec thought himself. Like in his mind, he engaged external counsel early, he made sure everything was labelled privilege, all of those things. It was actually about the state of mind of the board, the directors, and also the CEO, what they thought of the whole process as well. So if you're not clear with your stakeholders from the outset in those situations, okay, this has happened, this needs to be privileged, this is me performing my role as General Counsel, this is how we're going to go about these things, and you can really get yourself in hot water down the track. And it's an interesting case. It's a good cautionary tale. I think it certainly focuses the mind on how you need to handle those things.
Do you think that it's more challenging in that moment where you are in a crisis, where there's all hands on deck and you're dealing with whatever it might be, a data breach, some accident, whatever it might be, that gets a little strained?
I mean, I can only speak from my personal experience, and I was in a privately held environment. I didn't have to deal with ASX obligations or disclosures or anything like that. For me, in those situations, it actually, I found it easier because you have to focus and you know what your job is in those situations. And strangely enough, because of the role that you're in, because it's part of your role to help lead the business through these crises, people listen. So you establish your rules of engagement, and this is how it's going to be. And there's nothing like a crisis to get execs and board members to really sit up and say, okay, how are we gonna approach this? We're looking to you.
Yeah. And it's probably really important. Oh, sorry, Kate. It's probably really important, I think, in the crisis management plan and the mock crisis exercises that you do to spell all of that out clearly in the plan. I do think, Kate, to your point, when there is a crisis, everyone wants to help and everyone's trying to kind of do everything and pitch in, and you really, really, really need to be sure that you've drilled it, that you've got the documentation, the processes, everything laid out, and you stick to it, because it's in all of our natures to want to help, right? And to jump in and try to do everything. But in a crisis, it's really important for everyone to do the role that they've been previously assigned, in a moment of calm, that you've worked through it, you understand what the role is, and stick to it, and not try to do more than that, because that is probably where you could get yourself into trouble.
It's the opportunity to lean in. I think, never waste a good crisis. I think we've heard before, and it's the lawyer's opportunity to shine. But I think that's when you really lean in. You're not in that back sort of CoSec minute-taking space. You're forward, you're leading, you're involved. It's your show, really, to make sure that privilege is kept. And I think also your stakeholders, when you've gone through exercises, and I 100% recommend you do these run-throughs, they see the difference in how you turn up and how you present and how you conduct yourself in a crisis compared to in a normal board meeting.
I had an executive say to me in a crisis, "Who are you?" He'd never... He was like, "I've never seen this side of you before." He's from the UK. He used the analogy, I was like a sweeper in football, just at the back. And then all of a sudden, I needed to step up and try and save the ball from getting through to the net. And I took that as a compliment because, you do. You have to lean in. You have to step up. It's your time. You've got the skills. Just rely on that. And people will... to your point, Joanna, absolutely, people will try and help, but they will also listen if you are clear and you communicate constantly and well. Yeah.
I don't know if either of you have been in this situation, but I've been very fortunate. I don't think I've had a real-time crisis that has kind of got to the level of sort of having media scrutiny, but I've certainly done exercises where there's been mock reporters and doorstop interviews and all of that. And I think sometimes because general counsels are quite eloquent and, find verbal communication easy, when we've done all these practice runs, often people turn around and go, "Oh, well, if this ever happens, you should be our spokesperson because you did the best job at that. You were the best at sort of answering the questions in the way we wanted to answer and all of that." So I do think as a real life challenge around your role and the hat and all of that, thinking through what you would do if you were actually the one that was sort of fronting up to the media or a press conference. I know often it is the CEO because they're the sort of the face of the company, but I think at smaller companies perhaps where they're less comfortable or it's a less public organisation, it could be something you might be asked to do. So thinking through that as well and how you would manage that.
I would also recommend media training as part of your crisis management plan. It is amazing how you think you respond a certain way, but when you actually then hear yourself back and think, "Oh my goodness, why did I say that?" And usually it's the CEO that may or may not say that on reflection, but that media training is also a really good opportunity to practice.
Just building on that, I think in the media training as well, what that sort of PR lens can really help with too is how you deal with your clients, your customers, your suppliers who may have been impacted by whatever the crisis is. And I'll never forget a PR advisor said to me, "Do what you'd be proud to say you did." when you're communicating with these people that have been impacted by this thing, that you need to treat them as human beings that have been impacted by something and handle them as human beings. It's not about you. You shouldn't go into a situation defensively. Treat them as humans and handle it that way. And that really resonated, and that has informed the approach that we took with our crisis management response, and it worked for us. That sort of human-led approach, and that's something, again, because naturally we have to communicate and influence, and as you said, Joanna, often we're the ones that can do that the best. That's where we can really lead the response as well, and it's an important facet that shouldn't be forgotten, I think.
Couldn't agree more. I think even if you're not the person fronting the media, you're probably the person who's developing those key messages, where to go, where not to go. So very important skill. Perhaps while we're on skills, can we talk about governance? Ilona, you talked about being a governance professional, I think might have been the term that you used. And a number of you have talked about governance and the role, particularly from a CoSec perspective, that you have there. Wondering how you approach that when you do have both roles. How does it actually work in practice? Do you have to have a different approach to governance when you are a CoSec as well as a GC?
I think it's very time consuming. You have to be exceptionally well organised because you've got a lot of people relying on your organisational skills, your plans, your agendas, your all the documents kind of linking together. It's the one sort of one date or one meeting in one place that emanates through all facets of other documents. So if it changes here, it has to change through the whole suite. So you've got to be very almost religious about the process that you go through for every board calendar, every board agenda, every board meeting. The process is the same, but it is, I find it very time consuming. So it's not as if you can just outsource that to external counsel and come back and fiddle with it and there it goes. It's really real time, making sure that you've got very good organisational skills, because quite often in an ideal world, you think you'll deal with the chair and he reviews the agenda and it's all perfect, but in reality, it changes 97 times right up until the day before the meeting, if not, at the meeting. You're in the meeting, people are waiting, people are not waiting, we're not talking to them now they're back, you become very good at directing traffic, and then you've got this thing called minutes that somehow you're taking at the same time. But I think being organised, and probably one key takeaway with that is I always start with a draft set of minutes. The agenda roughly, the resolutions roughly that I think need to be passed, and I think that's just a really good place to start. Yes. So that you're not starting from complete scratch every time you go in there. I think that's just part of the suite of documents that you go in there with. And I'm still old school hard copy, like to have things in front of me, the action items, the agendas, the previous minutes, and it's all like mission control when I'm sitting there. I don't think anyone wants to sit on either side of me because I've got everything laid out. But just being very organised and knowing what's coming and what's next, and having that communication skill with the chair. Always make sure I sit next to the chair. This is where we're at. We're running late. We're running early. Do you want morning tea now? You're really kind of directing traffic, and you have to be highly organised.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I used to sort of somewhat sarcastically say I'm sort of the highest paid, executive assistant in Australia, because that is what you feel like sometimes. It's a lot of diary management and document management, directors. And as a director, I think I can say this can be a certain beast sometimes, and if they say I'd like an apple, you say would you like a red apple or a green apple? You need to kind of have that level of kind of service mentality, I think, often switched on as a CoSec, while at the same time, being the strong advocate around governance. It is very detail oriented, so I think I I think for me, I know when I do sort of those personality assessments and things, I've got quite a broad range from strategic right through to quite detail oriented. So that's a good mix. But if you don't love that side of things, I'd say probably perhaps don't pick up the CoSec role, because you will absolutely hate it. And then, as Ilona was saying, in terms of, it's not just she likes to have mission control, you have to know what the directors want. So there was one time I used to send documents in Word and people would say, well, we don't like that. We can't read them on the iPad. Well, then I would send them in PDF. Oh, I want to be able to mark it up. Then I would send it in both, and then one director would write back and say, why have you sent me 2 documents? Just going, right, okay, it's a lot of hand-holding. The chair will often just have you on speed dial. I mean, I will not say the name. Let's just make up a name, Dave. And my daughter used to laugh because every time hi, Dave, hi, Dave, hi, Dave, 15 times a day. So, you need, and not every chair will be like that. Some will be much more hands-off and you might talk to them a couple times a month. So understanding what the directors want is a big part of the CoSec role, while sort of obviously maintaining all appropriate governance. And then in the meetings, as everything is chopping and changing and lunch is coming and that person's late and that IT is not working, I just try to think of that, the duck just smoothly sailing across the water, but underneath you're texting and emailing and managing everything in the background. So, so kind of like an event coordinator sometimes.
Wow, I don't feel like you're selling it to me, Joanna and Ilona. And that analogy of the duck paddling, very fiercely under the water while looking smooth to all of the rest of the board is one that I've heard used about this role. So do you think that there is a natural alignment for lawyers to take on this company secretary role? Are we naturally good at that, or is it dependent on the individual?
I think it depends on the individual. I think our training helps, but Joanna made a really good point just then. If you're not a detail person, if you don't love herding cats, then perhaps maybe if you're more sort of a big picture person, then maybe it isn't the role for you. I do think though that boards, there's a lot of process and governance and all that stuff, but the challenging part is that boards are still people, and they're individuals with particular ways of working and particular personalities and quirks that we all have. And so that's the part that really requires, I don't think you can really understand how much of a part of the role that is, managing those people, those personalities, those ways of working, until you're actually in it. And that is, to do all of that and maintain serenity is you can only sort of really learn by doing, unless you're born that way, and I don't know how many people are. They're probably all astronauts. So it's a learned behaviour that you can only build over time. And as lawyers, that is something that through our profession, it's something that we have to develop anyway. So it does lend itself well to the CoSec role.
Mm. Well, we'll certainly touch on those relationships, building the ability to influence and create the trust with the board in a moment. But before we turn to that, just listening to the three of you, it sounds like a lot of work being a company secretary. We all know that the role of a general counsel is a never-ending bucket. As soon as one task is completed, the bucket seems to fill again. So how do you manage the workload?
I'm happy to have a go at that one. Look, my last 2 combined roles, one was a smaller company, so the exec side of the role was not as big as it might be at a more established organisation. The other one, I reported to the CEO, but I wasn't on the executive. I would say in both of those roles, the CoSec work took up about 80% of my time. I would say the legal work took up maybe 10%, and then the last 10% was trying to manage my poor neglected team. Now, luckily at one place I had a very small team, so that was easy, and the other place had a very experienced team. So, they were fairly self-sufficient and knew they could always get me if they needed me. But it can suck up a huge percentage of your time. So sometimes you don't have a choice. Maybe you're a sole counsel and they expect you to be GC, CoSec and manage all of that. But you should really think about that. Perhaps you're in a general counsel role and they're talking to you about combining the roles or moving CoSec under you. And I think unless you're somewhere at, say, an ASX 100 company where perhaps you've got the title of CoSec, you go to the board meeting, but you have a really great CoSec team underneath you doing most of the doing, it can be incredibly time consuming. So definitely be conscious of that and think through the implications of that before you step into that type of a role.
Well, Ilona, you're at a listed entity. What's your experience in terms of managing that workload?
Well, it is full on, I think it's fair to say. The thing is, though, at least with CoSec work, you've got a calendar. You know when the board meetings are going to happen. You know when papers need to be out. You know when agendas that you work backwards. And that annual plan is really your guiding light. Legal work comes. If you've got legal proceedings, if you've got an investigation, it's full on. You don't know when it's going to arrive at the doorstep. You don't know when. So I think the balance is that you've got that stability of knowing what's needed. So at least you can plan to the extent that you can plan. I would say maybe the GC side would be harder because you can't plan. You can come into work and think, I'm going to work on this matter today, and you don't even get to it because 10 other things come in that are more important. So I think having at least something in your weekly schedule that you know is going to happen is actually quite comforting because you can plan for it and you feel like you've achieved something because you know it's coming, it's done. And whereas, sometimes litigation goes on forever, there's another application, there's another defendant, and off we go, so.
Maybe it gives us an illusion of control.
It's the one thing we can count on.
But if you're someone that likes variety or you get bored easily, I would recommend absolutely that you can balance both. It is something you have to love, though, and if you're passionate about it, you'll invest in the time and the dedication, and then you'll slowly bring in resources when you need them, and so a deputy CoSec is also very helpful, can I say. But that's really after you've built that relationship with the board. They need to be comfortable that you've got it in hand rather than bringing, rotating someone else all the time. I think you build that relationship. They know that you've got the ball, and then you can slowly bring in resources to help you. And I think that's just a time and trust thing.
I think it's really important too, though, because particularly in organisations where boards meet monthly, if you don't, once you've built the trust, have some backup, it can be really hard even just to schedule leave, right? Because if you're not in a board meeting, you're dealing with the minutes or you're prepping the papers for the next month. It's sort of continuous. So that can be a real issue if you don't have that support.
Well, perhaps let's just turn to those relationships. You've talked, all three of you, about the importance of developing the relationship, particularly with the chair. And I think it was mentioned that you have really a different set of stakeholders or key relationships when you're in that role of GC. Can you tell me a bit about how you went about in your first CoSec role, building that trusted relationship with the chair? Was it tricky? Any tips?
Oh, look, for me, it was quite easy because I started off as general counsel, and again, it was a smaller business, it wasn't listed. Started off as GC and did that role for about 3 years before I was given CoSec as well. So I already got to know, the chair had already been involved in the business, so I'd already gotten to know her anyway. We had a good sort of foundational rapport, and then it was really a case of, okay, I've got this role now, listening, asking her questions and listening to how she liked to operate, and going from there. It was quite simple, but I know that that's not always the case, and particularly when you're going into an organisation starting from scratch in that CoSec role, it could be quite a different story.
Ilona, what's been your experience?
Oh, look, I think building stakeholder relationships is fundamental both as a general counsel and as a company secretary. So I think, and Georgie touched on it before, people, they're human beings. Our board directors I'm one of them now. I'm also a human being. It's an interesting process, but they all work the way that they work. They've got a preferred way of working. You do kind of have to know everybody's little ways that they work best. So if you can actually bring the best of each of them together and help with that, I think that you have a much more flowing and conducive board meeting, because everyone's kind of in their good spot. They've got all the tools they need to bring their best selves to the board meeting. Having those one-on-one coffees with each of the board members is very helpful. It's probably the best 20 minutes you'll ever invest. And that's just not with the chair, that's with every single member. Talk to them. How do they work well? What do they want from the company secretarial role? How do they see that different from the general counsel role? Because, they'll have different requests for different hats that you're wearing as well. So I think taking the time, investing in going out of the office, having a coffee, meeting them as human beings. Some of them are actually really nice people, right? So take them away from the boardroom. It's amazing what you can learn yourself from them. So I think engaging in that piece is really important. But also, I don't know if others have found this, but there's always new board members, right? Boards change, and you just get comfortable, and then there's a new one, and the boards rotate. So I have found also that after maybe the first or second meeting of a new board member joining, I will purposely take them out for coffee and ask them how they're going in the new board. Have they got everything that they need? And quite often they will ask you for feedback on how they're going. Is it normal for people to ask questions like I do? So I think you've got that ability as well to make it a two-way street and be able to share both ways. And you then open that transparent conversation and trust relationship that you're not going to talk about in front of everybody, but you're more comfortable to talk on a one-on-one. So I think that's also very helpful.
Yeah, again, great tips. Thanks, Ilona. Joanna, can I ask you a question that is somewhat related? I would imagine at times, if you're seen to be getting too close to the chair, that might or might not create a bit of tension with your relationship, say with the CEO. How do you navigate something like that?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting, and it's all a bit more of an art than a science, right? So all of that internal stakeholder management, which I think is something I've gotten better at as I've gotten older, hopefully. A slightly more self-awareness, I think, is a great quality to work on as you go through life. It then helps you manage yourself and manage your relationships better. Look, I've been in some fairly stressful situations involving whether it's a regulatory investigation or political pressure or reputational risks, where you have, the chair might feel under pressure, the CEO might feel under pressure, other directors, other executives, and you're sort of often you feel like you're in the middle of this spinning wheel, and you're kind of juggling all of these various people, and they might all need individual advice, let alone as a board, as an entity. And so trying to be very, very clear. I've had a couple of interim roles, and I couldn't actually tell you. I'd have to go back and ask, which I think would be really interesting. I do seem to gain people's trust quite quickly, and I have also stepped into roles where someone has failed to do that, and objectively looking at them, and I've met these people, they're hugely competent, they're good people. So what is it that has worked for me and not worked for them? I'd have to go back and ask the chairs. Maybe I should do that as some type of governance study at some point. But I think just having people know that you're trustworthy. I do find CoSec a very service-oriented position, but it's almost like you have to have a soft front and a hard back. So you're very service-oriented. You might be quite, particularly some more old-school directors, quite, deferential, but you've got to have that hard back in terms of drawing lines where they need to be drawn. And luckily, I haven't too often been in a position where I have felt any kind of pressure on that side. So yes, it is definitely something to consider. I think all of us, in whatever role we have, sometimes you've got a dual reporting line as just a general counsel, or you've got, other kind of pressures internally where you've got to kind of just be conscious of it and hopefully give people enough love that they don't worry that you're sort of forming some kind of alignment. And being a person of your word, is just always kind of my motto, so people know that when you speak to them that you're being upfront to the extent you're able to.
Yeah, great points. Anything you want to add to that conversation, Georgie?
I think you've pretty much summed it all up. Dealing with different stakeholders and, that service ethic, also creating those relationships. It is definitely an art. It does have the effect, I don't know if others have found this as well, while you're doing all of that and trying to make sure that everything's done and making sure that you're considering everything and that you're thinking about the risks and all of those other things and wearing both hats and all that stuff, I actually found it sometimes quite an isolating experience, because you're really the only person that has to do all of that. And so I would say, do make sure that you are well supported, whether that's you have a good relationship with the external counsels that you use, you have a good mentor outside of work, or through the communities that are the link communities that are popping up, Law Ninjas, Lawyer Mums Australia, those sorts of communities that are popping up where it's completely free, to get some sounding board, just understand that you're actually not alone. There's lots of people performing these roles. And making sure that you have that support, because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, and it is fairly unique for people that wear both those hats.
I think that's a really good point, and I was speaking with Georgie yesterday about how, often what you're working on as a GC CoSec, your team may not even know about. You might be the only lawyer in an organisation working on an M&A deal or aware of a regulatory investigation, and I was saying that there was a certain partner at a firm that every time I spoke to him, I said, oh my God, I just feel like you're my therapist. And I thought, oh, well, this is what we're paying for, which is sort of my emotional well-being to help myself get through all of the stress that, we as a business owner, but myself as an individual, because I didn't have anyone else I could really speak to about it. So I think, if that's what you use your external counsel for, that's probably time and money very well spent.
Fabulous. Just one more topic I want to touch on before we finish. Given we've been talking about the enormous workload that both the GC has, but when it's a combined role, it's even more of an issue. What has been your experience in looking at tools, technologies, or even data in terms of helping you with these dual roles? Perhaps Ilona, interested in whether you're using anything, given the nature of the company that you work for, when technology and data is such a huge part of that business. How does it help you with the dual role?
Look, I think every in-house team and every company secretariat team is looking at technology in terms of making things easier, faster, less errors in terms of human errors. We use Diligent as our board portal, and I think it's probably fair to say, like most other organisations, we don't utilise it fully. We utilise the parts that work well for us. I'm still a little bit old school in terms of, as I mentioned before, having things printed, and I tend to do things more by hand and then get that typed in or corrected myself, just so that I know that it's accurate and it's there. And also from a security perspective, I think people are still not quite sure. I think lawyers ourselves are a little bit slow to adopt technology in a way that we're comfortable that it's secure and safe. But I think also on every GC's roadmap, which includes the company secretary function, you need to have a product roadmap of where you're going for your department, so you do embrace technology, because otherwise you'll get left behind. So we're still in process. We've now got to a point where I've had a very busy couple of years where I am at the moment, and now we're at that point in time where we can start lifting the bar to making things a little bit more easier, and using and adopting technology for that reason.
The thing that I've seen with in this new role that I'm in, where I'm working with, still functioning as an in-house counsel, but for a few different clients, and certainly my personal experience as well, is that adopting tech is great, but it's only as good as the time and energy you spend putting into it. And often particularly when you're wearing both hats, you don't have that time, and it can be really hard to carve out that time, and so you end up buying something that you only use about 20% of and can't get the uptake that you need for it to really function and make things easier for you. So I think if you are looking at tech, you need to invest in it, not just from a financial perspective, but from a time perspective, and really champion it to get the best out of it, so that it'll work for you. Because the amount of times that I've seen solutions just sitting on the metaphorical shelf, only being half used, and legal teams are still struggling to just demonstrate their value, is, it's unfortunate. So I think, that's definitely an area to invest in.
I think as well, it hasn't been something, probably for all the reasons that Georgie and Ilona have just flagged, that I've had a huge amount of time to spend looking into. But you've also got to think about who your stakeholders are on the board side, given the demographics of most directors. Sometimes you would not want to move too rapidly to a very, modern technology solution. I think I can say that. And even just sometimes basic things like, there's a function in Diligent where everyone can edit minutes in the same document. You do sometimes have to give very, very step-by-step directions about how to do that. And then sometimes the technology doesn't work, and that causes this huge amount of frustration. And so I think just, again, going back to the people being human, one other sort of slightly tangential but related point that I thought about earlier is, I think as well you need to keep in mind that your directors are probably directors at many companies. And I think as CoSec and management teams, you can get very frustrated that the director doesn't remember how this technology works, or doesn't remember that this is how you review the minutes, or doesn't remember that that's what happened at the last meeting. But you've got to sort of show them some grace that they've probably had 5 other board meetings between when you last spoke to them and now. They've read hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of paper. And so whatever you can do to help reorient them every time they come back into your company's ecosystem and drop the cookie crumbs to help them get down the path you want them to get down to, whether that is with technology or with content. I know the directors would be hugely appreciative. You will help them do their job better and then help the board function more effectively as well.
Thank you. Well, look, our time has almost disappeared. That certainly happened pretty quickly. I have been madly taking notes because I've learnt a lot today and got some great tips from all of you around your experience with these dual roles. I'm just looking down at my notes, and I think your point, Ilona, about having coffee with each of the directors on a regular basis, the best 20 minutes that you could spend. Your comment, Joanna, about having a soft front and a hard back. I think that that's a skill that perhaps a general counsel needs, as well as a company secretary skill, that if you want to head down this path of taking on that company secretary role, you need to be incredibly organised, interested in that capability, develop those skills, but there's some great benefits for your current role in terms of understanding the strategy, having that seat at the table, developing those relationships with the directors and the chair, but also great skills to take further in your next role. So I can see the benefits. I'm more convinced than when I started this discussion. But before we close this, I just want to see if there's any other tips. You've given some great ones today, all three of you, but is there anything else that you'd like the audience to hear?
I think for me, what I wish I'd known going into my first GC and CoSec role was actually, yes, you need all this knowledge and these skills, but you also need a healthy dose of common sense. And you have that. You wouldn't be in your role if you didn't have good judgment. You've got great gut judgment. You've got an understanding and appreciation of risk. You can communicate well and clearly. You've got this. Leverage your mentors, leverage your external advisors. invest in those relationships with the board members, and also as a general counsel with your CEO and the executive team. It is a great opportunity and you'll be great. That's what I'd say.
Mine is probably very basic, which is my first GC CoSec role. I wanted to do the AICD course, and I went to the CEO and said, look, I want to do this. Would the company perhaps consider paying for half of it? Like, I thought that was quite an aggressive ask. And he was like, why wouldn't we just pay for the whole thing? And I went, oh, okay. So, like, don't sell yourself short. Maybe go and ask if you want to do one of the Governance Association or the Governance Institute's courses or AICD. Go ask, you know. The worst they can do is say no. They might say yes, or you might, you might at least get a contribution towards it. And I think that that broader kind of non-pure legal training, getting more of that governance grounding is it just a huge help in sort of setting you up for success.
Agreed. I would have one to add on to all of that is to find yourself a mentor that is not an external lawyer but is a CoSec, because that's who you need to have on speed dial about administrative things that you won't get from necessarily your external counsel. It's someone that's sat in the seat and have had to type out things themselves. They've learned it the hard way maybe, but the benefit is you'll gain from their experience. If you can find someone, please do it. I know all of us that have sat in these roles, we're more than happy to help the new generations of CoSecs coming through, because we've had to do the hard yards and we wouldn't wish that on anybody. So, stand on the shoulders of giants, they say. So find yourself a mentor and have someone available that you can reach out to and ask for help.
Yeah, what a great point to end on. And certainly at Law Squared, our corporate governance team is here to help if you do have particular challenges from a corporate governance perspective, or the board needs support, and our team have sat in these roles. We deliberately look for people with that practical experience, because otherwise, you're right, Ilona, very difficult to understand just in isolation without having sat in that role. But in closing, I would love to thank each and every one of our incredible panellists. As I said, I've got some fantastic tips and learnt a lot more and feel quite inspired by the discussion today. So thank you so much, Joanna, Ilona, Georgie, for spending the last hour talking about these issues with us. And thanks everybody for watching this. We'll certainly go through all of those questions we've seen and we'll come back to you shortly. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, everyone.